Sarah Johnson's day had started like any other Sunday. She was relaxing at home in her comfortable sweatpants and oversized Harvard Medical School sweater, enjoying a rare day off from her demanding job as a neurosurgeon. The morning sun streamed through her living room windows as she sipped her favorite chamomile tea, looking forward to catching up on some medical journals. That's when her phone rang. The hospital's chief of staff was on the line, his voice urgent. "Dr. Johnson, we need you in Boston immediately. The governor's chief of staff has suffered a brain aneurysm. You're the best in the field, and they've specifically requested you for the surgery." Sarah didn't hesitate. Within 20 minutes, she had changed into fresh clothes, packed her essential medical equipment, and was driving her Tesla Model X toward the private airport terminal. The hospital had arranged a private jet to fly her to Boston, knowing that every minute counted in cases like these. The autumn weather was pleasant as Sarah pulled into the airport's exclusive parking area. She grabbed her medical bag and briefcase, making sure she had all her credentials and documentation. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore simple black slacks with a navy blazer over a white blouse. Comfortable enough for the flight, but professional enough for her arrival in Boston. As she walked toward the private terminal entrance, Sarah noticed how quiet everything was. Unlike the main airport terminal, this section catered exclusively to private flights and high-profile clients. The building itself was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the morning sun. A few expensive cars were parked nearby, Bentleys, Rolls-Royces, and other luxury vehicles that regular visitors to this terminal typically drove. Sarah had flown from this terminal several times before when called for emergency surgeries in other cities. The staff usually recognized her, but today she noticed an unfamiliar face at the security checkpoint. A middle-aged white man with a stern expression and a security guard's uniform stood at his post, watching her approach with obvious suspicion in his eyes. Checking her watch, Sarah saw that she was right on schedule. The flight was due to leave in 30 minutes, giving her plenty of time to clear security and board the jet. She pulled out her identification, medical license, and the flight authorization that the hospital had emailed her. Years of experience had taught her to always be over-prepared with documentation, especially in exclusive spaces like this one. The click of her low heels echoed through the quiet terminal as she approached the security desk. A few other travelers, mostly older men in expensive suits, were scattered around the waiting area, some looking up from their phones or laptops to observe her. Sarah maintained her professional demeanor, used to being one of the few women, and often the only black person, in such spaces. "Good morning," Sarah said politely to the security guard, holding out her credentials. "I'm Dr. Sarah Johnson. I have a flight scheduled to Boston for an emergency surgery." Her voice was clear and confident, the same tone she used when directing her medical team in the operating room. The guard, whose name tag read Richard Miller, barely glanced at her documents. Instead, he looked her up and down with an expression that Sarah knew all too well. It was a look that questioned her very presence in this space, that suggested she couldn't possibly belong here among the private jets and wealthy executives. "Ma'am, this is a private terminal," Miller said slowly, as if speaking to a child. "The main passenger terminal is in the next building." He gestured dismissively toward the exit, not even bothering to examine her credentials. Sarah took a deep breath, keeping her expression neutral. After 15 years as one of the country's top neurosurgeons, she had encountered this type of treatment before. Usually, showing her credentials was enough to end any questions about her belonging. But something in Miller's stance, the way he planted his feet, crossed his arms, and smirked slightly, told her this situation might be different. "Yes, I'm aware this is the private terminal," Sarah replied calmly, still holding out her documents. "As I mentioned, I'm Dr. Sarah Johnson. I have a scheduled private flight to Boston for an emergency surgery. All my documentation is right here." The air in the terminal seemed to grow thicker with tension as other travelers began to notice the exchange. A young woman sitting nearby slowly raised her phone, its camera lens pointing in their direction. The stage was set for what would become a viral moment of confrontation between privilege and prejudice, though none of the participants knew it yet. Richard Miller straightened his security uniform and puffed out his chest. In his 15 years of working security at various locations, he had developed what he considered a sixth sense about who belonged and who didn't. To him, the woman standing before him definitely didn't belong in this exclusive terminal. "Look, miss," he said, emphasizing the word Miss rather than using the title Doctor that Sarah had provided. I don't know how you got into this area, but this terminal is for authorized personnel and private flight passengers only. He waved his hand dismissively at her documents, still refusing to even look at them. Sarah remained professional, though she could feel her heart rate increasing. A quick glance at her watch reminded her that every minute wasted here meant delayed treatment for her patient in Boston. She tried again, this time pulling out her hospital ID card with its gold trim marking her status as a board member. "Mr. Miller," she said, reading his name tag again, "I understand you're doing your job. However, I am Dr. Sarah Johnson, head of neurosurgery at Memorial Hospital and a member of the hospital board. This flight has been arranged because a patient in Boston needs emergency surgery. Time is crucial here." Miller's face reddened. The more credentials Sarah presented, the more determined he seemed to become in his obstruction. He stepped out from behind his security desk, using his height to try to intimidate her. "Anyone can print fancy papers these days," he scoffed. "I've worked this terminal for 6 months, and I've never seen you before. The doctors who fly through here don't look like, well, they just look different." He left the implication hanging in the air. By now, several more passengers had gathered nearby, watching the scene unfold. Some had their phones out, recording the interaction. An elderly gentleman in an expensive suit frowned deeply as he observed Miller's behavior. Sarah took another steady breath, her medical training helping her maintain composure. "Mr. Miller, would you at least look at my identification? A hospital's chief of staff can verify my identity, as can the pilot who's waiting for me. This is an emergency medical situation." Instead of checking her documents, Miller reached for his radio. "Yeah, this is Miller at the main checkpoint. I got a situation here. Someone trying to access the terminal with what I suspect are fake credentials. Might need backup." He emphasized the word fake while staring directly at Sarah. A young flight attendant who had been walking by stopped in her tracks. She recognized Dr. Johnson from previous flights, but before she could speak up, Miller cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside," Miller said to Sarah, his voice getting louder. "In fact, you need to leave the terminal before I call law enforcement. We take security very seriously here." The growing crowd of onlookers began to murmur. A businessman in a pinstripe suit pulled out his phone and appeared to be making a call, shaking his head in disapproval at the scene before him. Sarah stood her ground, her voice remaining steady even as Miller's became more aggressive. "I will not leave. I have a patient waiting for emergency surgery, and every minute we waste here puts their life at greater risk. Please, just verify my credentials. You can call the hospital, check with the flight crew, or contact your supervisor." "Listen here," Miller said, stepping even closer. "I don't care what kind of story you've made up. I know every doctor who flies through here, and none of them look like you. This is a private terminal for important people, not for—" Before he could finish his discriminatory remark, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "What exactly is going on here?" Everyone turned to see an elegant woman in her 50s, wearing a crisp suit with an airport executive badge, striding purposefully toward the scene. Her heels clicked authoritatively on the marble floor as she approached, her expression a mixture of concern and barely contained anger. The atmosphere in the terminal shifted instantly. Miller's face went from red to pale as he recognized his supervisor, Mrs. Diana Chen, the airport's chief of operations. She was known for her zero-tolerance policy toward any form of discrimination, and the look on her face suggested she had seen and heard enough. Mrs. Diana Chen's arrival changed the entire atmosphere of the terminal. Miller, who had been so confident moments ago, took an unconscious step backward. The security guard's face was now covered in sweat, but his stubbornness hadn't completely disappeared. "Mrs. Chen," Miller started, trying to sound authoritative, "I was just handling a security situation. This person is trying to access the private terminal with suspicious documentation." Diana Chen's eyes narrowed. She had been watching the scene unfold on the terminal's security cameras for the past few minutes, and what she had witnessed made her blood boil. "Suspicious documentation?" she repeated slowly. "You mean the credentials you refused to even look at?" Sarah took this opportunity to step forward, still maintaining her professional composure. "Mrs. Chen, I'm Dr. Sarah Johnson. I have an emergency flight scheduled to Boston for a critical surgery. I've been trying to show Mr. Miller my identification and flight authorization for the past 15 minutes. Diana's face softened as she turned to Sarah. Dr. Johnson, of course. You flew with us just last month for that complicated surgery in Chicago. She turned back to Miller, her expression hardening again. Mr. Miller, Dr. Johnson is one of our most frequent VIP passengers. Miller's face went through a series of emotions, disbelief, embarrassment, and then a desperate attempt to justify his actions. But she doesn't look like our usual passengers. I was just following security protocols. By now, the terminal had grown quite crowded. At least 20 people had gathered around, many still recording with their phones. A young social media influencer was already typing rapidly on her phone, no doubt sharing the incident in real time with her followers. Following protocols? Diana's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. Please explain which protocol instructs you to refuse to check a passenger's credentials. Which protocol tells you to judge someone based on their appearance? An older gentleman in the crowd spoke up. I've been watching this whole thing. This guard didn't even look at the doctor's ID. He just assumed she didn't belong here because she's black. I got it all on video. Several other witnesses nodded in agreement. A flight attendant stepped forward. Dr. Johnson has flown with us multiple times. She's always been nothing but professional and kind to our staff. Miller started to sweat even more. I was just trying to maintain security. You can't be too careful these days. Careful? Diana interrupted. Careful would have been checking Dr. Johnson's credentials when she first presented them. Careful would have been following actual security protocols instead of making assumptions based on prejudice. Sarah checked her watch again, concern crossing her face. Mrs. Chen, I hate to interrupt. My patient in Boston. Diana immediately sprang into action. Of course, Dr. Johnson. Please, let me escort you to your flight personally. She turned to another security officer who had just arrived. Please take over for Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller, you are suspended effective immediately. Report to HR before leaving the premises. But Miller wasn't going down without one last attempt. This is ridiculous. I was doing my job. You can't suspend me for maintaining security. I'll file a complaint. His loud outburst caught the attention of even more travelers, and now phones from every direction were recording his meltdown. A business executive in the crowd was already on the phone with what sounded like a news station. Mr. Miller, Diana's voice was ice cold. Every word you've said, every action you've taken has been recorded on our security cameras. Your behavior today violated at least 15 company policies, not to mention basic human decency. Security will escort you to HR. As two security officers approached Miller, he finally seemed to realize the gravity of his situation. His face turned ashen as he watched Dr. Johnson being escorted to her gate by Mrs. Chen, followed by apologetic looks from nearly everyone in the terminal. The crowd began to disperse. The damage was done. Videos were already being uploaded, messages were being sent, and social media was beginning to buzz with the story of the racist security guard who tried to stop a prominent neurosurgeon from saving a patient's life. A young intern working at the terminal's coffee shop shook her head as she watched Miller being led away. Social media is going to eat him alive, she whispered to her coworker. This is definitely going viral. Diana Chen moved quickly through the terminal with Dr. Sarah Johnson, her heels clicking rapidly on the polished floor. Behind them, they could still hear Miller's protests fading as security led them away. The chief of operations was both angry and embarrassed about what had just happened at her terminal. Dr. Johnson, I cannot apologize enough for this incident, Diana said as they walked. This is absolutely not what our airport stands for. She gestured to a private elevator that would take them directly to the tarmac where the jet was waiting. Sarah nodded professionally, though the stress of the confrontation showed slightly in her eyes. I appreciate your intervention, Mrs. Chen. But right now, my biggest concern is getting to my patient in Boston. As they rode the elevator down, Diana's phone was buzzing constantly. The incident had already started spreading across social media platforms. One of the videos, posted by a well-known business executive who had witnessed everything, was gaining thousands of views per minute. When they reached the tarmac, the pilot was standing at the bottom of the jet's stairs, looking worried. Captain Michael Rodriguez had been informed of the situation and was visibly upset that one of his regular passengers had been treated so poorly. Dr. Johnson, he called out, checking his watch. "We've already received clearance for takeoff. We can make up some time in the air." The flight crew had prepared everything in advance, knowing the urgency of the medical situation. Just then, Diana's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and her eyes widened. "It's the airport board chairman," she told Sarah. "This situation has already reached the highest levels." Before Sarah could respond, a group of reporters had somehow made their way to the edge of the tarmac. The story was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. Camera flashes started going off in the distance as security moved to intercept the media. "Dr. Johnson," one reporter shouted from afar, "can you comment on the discriminatory treatment you just experienced?" Sarah turned to Diana, her expression serious. "This isn't just about me. This is about every professional who's ever been judged by their appearance rather than their credentials. Something needs to change." Diana nodded firmly. "And it will. I promise you that." She pulled out her business card and handed it to Sarah. "When you're finished with your surgery in Boston, I'd like to discuss implementing new training programs. Your input would be invaluable." The pilot gestured urgently from the stairs. "Dr. Johnson, we really need to depart now to make up for lost time." As Sarah climbed the stairs to the jet, more airport officials had gathered on the tarmac. The incident was quickly becoming a major crisis for the airport's management. Diana was already on her phone, calling an emergency meeting of the airport's Diversity and Inclusion Board. Inside the jet, the flight attendant, Maria, was especially attentive. "Dr. Johnson, we prepared your usual setup, laptop space, and a cup of green tea. The flight time to Boston will be approximately 47 minutes. As the jet's engine started up, Sarah could see through the window that the crowd on the tarmac had grown even larger. Airport officials were huddled in serious discussion, and the media presence had increased despite security's best efforts. The plane began to taxi, and Sarah took a moment to close her eyes and steady herself. Her phone buzzed with a message from the hospital in Boston. "Patient stable but time critical. Theater being prepared for your arrival." Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom. "Dr. Johnson, we'll be taking a more direct route to Boston. Air traffic control has given us priority clearance. Expected arrival time is 11:15 a.m. As the jet took off, Sarah could see the private terminal getting smaller below. What had started as a routine emergency call had turned into something much bigger, a moment that would force one of the country's most exclusive airports to confront its institutional biases. A news helicopter was now hovering near the airport, covering the story that was rapidly becoming viral. Sarah's phone continued to buzz with messages of support from colleagues who had already seen the videos, but she turned it to silent mode. Right now, her focus needed to be on the patient waiting in Boston. The flight attendant approached with a concerned look. "Dr. Johnson, CNN is requesting a statement. Would you like me to respond?" Sarah shook her head. "Not now. After the surgery. Right now, there's a life that needs saving, and that's all that matters." While Dr. Sarah Johnson was in the air heading to Boston, the situation at the airport was exploding into a major news story. Diana Chen sat in her office, surrounded by airport board members who had rushed in for an emergency meeting. The television mounted on the wall was playing one of the viral videos of the incident, which had already reached over 1 million views. "This is a disaster," said James Thompson, one of the board members, running his hands through his gray hair. "Do you realize who Dr. Johnson actually is? She's not just any doctor." Diana looked up from her computer, where she had been reviewing Dr. Johnson's file. Her eyes widened as she read through the complete information. She's on the board of directors for Memorial Health System." "Exactly," James replied. "The same health system that owns 30% of our private aviation company. She's technically one of our owners." The room fell silent as this information sank in. On the television, a news anchor was interviewing one of the passengers who had witnessed the incident. The witness was describing how Miller had refused to even look at Dr. Johnson's credentials. Diana's phone rang again. This time it was from the governor's office. She put it on speaker mode. "Mrs. Chen," the governor's chief of staff's wife said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I just wanted you to know that Dr. Johnson is the surgeon who's coming to operate on my husband. He had a brain aneurysm this morning, and she's the only one qualified to perform this particular procedure. That racist guard of yours almost prevented her from saving my husband's life." The board members exchanged worried looks. The situation was getting worse by the minute. Another board member pulled up Dr. Johnson's professional profile on his tablet. "Look at this," he said, turning the tablet for everyone to see. Dr. Johnson graduated top of her class from Harvard Medical School. She's pioneered 3 new neurosurgical procedures. She's been featured in Time magazine as one of the most influential doctors in the country. And our security guard treated her like she was trespassing. On social media, the hashtag Dr. Johnson deserves better was trending. Medical professionals from around the country were sharing their own stories of discrimination, inspired by what happened to Dr. Johnson. Meanwhile, Richard Miller sat in the HR office, watching his career crumble. The HR director was reviewing the security footage of the incident for the 3rd time. "Mr. Miller," the HR director said sternly, "do you realize that Dr. Johnson has performed emergency surgeries on 3 of our board members' family members in the past year? She's saved countless lives, and you didn't even bother to look at her ID." Miller slumped in his chair, his face pale. I didn't know. How was I supposed to know?" "That's exactly the point," the HR director replied. "You weren't supposed to judge her at all. You were supposed to check her credentials, just like you do with everyone else." Back in Diana's office, the airport's legal team had joined the meeting. They were discussing the potential ramifications of the incident when a call came in from Memorial Health Systems CEO. "We need to talk about the systematic discrimination at your airport," the CEO stated firmly. "Dr. Johnson is not just our best neurosurgeon. She's also leading our hospital's diversity and inclusion programs. Perhaps it's time she does the same for your airport." As the implications of the morning's events continued to unfold, news helicopters still circled the airport. Reporters interviewed witnesses who kept coming forward with their recordings and stories. The young social media influencer's post had now been shared hundreds of thousands of times. Diana stood at her office window, watching another private jet take off. The airport's reputation had taken a massive hit, but perhaps this was the wake-up call they needed. She picked up her phone to call the airport's training department. "We need to completely overhaul our security training," she said. "And I think I know exactly who should help us design the new program." On her desk, her computer chimed with a new email. It was from the governor's office, thanking them for ensuring Dr. Johnson's swift departure to Boston despite the unfortunate incident. The governor himself had taken an interest in the story, and his office was now calling for a review of discrimination policies at all state transportation facilities. By late afternoon, the consequences of Miller's actions were spreading like wildfire. The story had made it to national news networks, and social media couldn't stop talking about it. Inside the airport's HR department, Miller sat alone, staring at his termination papers with trembling hands. Effective immediately, the document read. His 6-month career at the prestigious private terminal had ended in disgrace. As he packed up his small locker, his phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications. Someone had identified him in the viral videos, and his name was now trending for all the wrong reasons. "Your final paycheck will be processed next week," the HR manager told him coldly. "Security will escort you to your car." Miller noticed how his former colleagues wouldn't even look at him as he walked past. The same security officers who used to joke with him during lunch breaks now treated him like a stranger. Meanwhile, in Boston, Dr. Sarah Johnson had successfully completed the emergency surgery on the governor's chief of staff. As she walked out of the operating room, she was met by a crowd of reporters waiting in the hospital lobby. The story had grown even bigger during her 4-hour surgery. Back at the airport, Diana Chen was handling one crisis after another. The private aviation company's stock had dropped 5% after investors learned about the incident. Major clients were calling, demanding to know what changes would be made to prevent similar incidents in the future. "We're implementing immediate changes," Diana assured another angry client over the phone. "All security staff will undergo mandatory retraining starting tomorrow morning." The airport's public relations team had set up a command center in one of the conference rooms. They were dealing with hundreds of media inquiries and monitoring the growing social media storm. The original videos of the incident had now been viewed over 10 million times. Miller, now at home, turned on his TV only to see his own face on the news. Former airport security guard Richard Miller has become the latest example of racial profiling in America, a news anchor was saying. His confrontation with renowned neurosurgeon Dr. Sarah Johnson has sparked a national conversation about bias in private spaces. His phone rang. It was his mother. "Richard, how could you?" she cried. "I raised you better than this." Miller hung up, unable to face even his own family's disappointment. At the airport board's emergency meeting, the decisions were swift and decisive. "We're not just firing Miller," the board chairman announced. "We're using this as an opportunity for complete systemic change." The new policies were drafted immediately. Every security staff member would be required to complete 40 hours of diversity and bias training. New hiring practices would focus on building a more diverse security team. A zero-tolerance policy for any form of discrimination would be implemented. Body cameras would become mandatory for all security personnel. A new oversight committee would be established to review any complaints of discrimination. The airport's largest clients, including several Fortune 500 companies, had threatened to take their business elsewhere unless significant changes were made. The financial implications were enormous. Miller's former supervisor was also fired for having ignored previous complaints about his behavior. An investigation revealed that other minorities had filed complaints about Miller in the past, but they had been brushed aside. By evening, Miller's face was on every major news network. His previous employer called to inform him that they would be removing him from their reference list. His social media accounts were flooded with angry messages, forcing him to delete them all. The aviation company's CEO released a public statement. "What happened today goes against everything we stand for. We are deeply sorry to Dr. Johnson and anyone else who has faced discrimination in our facilities. We are committed to making lasting changes." Civil rights organizations began calling for investigations into other private terminals across the country. The incident had sparked a broader conversation about exclusivity and racism in private aviation. As the day drew to a close, Miller sat alone in his apartment, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. His phone showed a missed call from his lawyer. He was being sued for civil rights violations. His career in security was over, and his reputation was destroyed, all because he had let his prejudice override his professionalism. The airport's new slogan appeared on the evening news: "Excellence through inclusivity." It was a direct response to the day's events, but for Miller, it was a harsh reminder of how his bigotry had backfired spectacularly. 2 weeks after the incident, the private terminal looked very different. New faces in security uniforms greeted passengers, and colorful posters promoting diversity and inclusion decorated the walls. But the biggest change was happening in the terminal's main conference room, where Dr. Sarah Johnson stood before a group of airport staff. "Discrimination isn't always obvious," Sarah explained to the attentive audience. "Sometimes it's hidden in small assumptions we make about others." Instead of pressing charges against the airport, she had accepted their invitation to help transform their culture. The room was packed. Security staff, flight crews, and terminal employees listened intently as Sarah shared her experiences. In the front row, Diana Chen nodded along, taking detailed notes. The airport had hired diversity consultants, but having Dr. Johnson speak to the staff personally made a much stronger impact. "I could have easily sued," Sarah continued, clicking to the next slide in her presentation. "Instead, I chose to help create change. Today, we're going to learn how to recognize our own biases and overcome them." In the back of the room, a young security guard raised her hand. "Dr. Johnson, how do we handle situations where we're genuinely unsure about someone's credentials?" Sarah smiled. "Excellent question. The key is to treat everyone with the same level of respect while following proper verification procedures. Let me show you some examples." Meanwhile, the story had inspired change beyond just one airport. Private terminals across the country were reviewing their policies. The hashtag #CheckDomTasum had become a movement in the aviation security industry. During a coffee break, Diana shared some news with Sarah. "The changes are already making a difference," she said, showing Sarah some statistics on her tablet. "Customer satisfaction is up, and we've received praise for our new training program. Several other airports want to implement similar changes." Sarah's phone buzzed with a message. It was from the governor's chief of staff, now recovering well from his surgery. He was watching the training session via video conference, along with other state officials interested in the program. The afternoon session focused on practical scenarios. Sarah worked with the security team, role-playing different situations. The new security chief, a woman named Maria Rodriguez, had replaced Miller's supervisor and brought fresh perspectives to the team. Remember, Maria told her staff, "Our job is to ensure safety while treating everyone with dignity." Dr. Johnson isn't just helping us become better security officers, she's helping us become better people. In another part of the city, the local news was interviewing Richard Miller's replacement, a former Air Force surgeon named James Washington. "We're building a security team that reflects our diverse passengers," he explained. "Safety and respect go hand in hand." Sarah's training sessions weren't just about avoiding discrimination. She helped the airport develop new protocols that made security checks both thorough and respectful. The staff learned to pay attention to documentation rather than appearances and to communicate professionally with all passengers. By late afternoon, Sarah was reviewing the new security guidelines with the airport board. The document was titled "Excellence Through Equity, a New Standard in Aviation Security." "These changes will cost money," one board member pointed out. "Discrimination costs more," Sarah replied firmly. "Just ask your insurance company about the increased premiums after the incident." The board members nodded in agreement. The airport's legal team had calculated that the new training program cost far less than potential discrimination lawsuits. As the day wound down, Sarah watched a new shift of security officers starting their work. They wore body cameras, carried tablets with the new protocols, and greeted each passenger with the same professional courtesy. "Dr. Johnson," Diana called out as Sarah prepared to leave. "The governor's office called. They want to make our program the standard for all state transportation facilities. Would you be willing to help with that too?" Sarah looked around the terminal one last time. The same space where she had faced discrimination 2 weeks ago was now becoming a model for change. New security officers were checking credentials carefully but courteously, treating each passenger with equal respect. "Yes," Sarah replied, "but on one condition: we don't just teach them what not to do. We teach them how to create a culture of genuine respect and inclusion." As she walked out of the terminal, Sarah noticed a new sign above the security checkpoint: "Respect first, security always." It wasn't just a slogan, it was a promise of transformation. 6 months after the incident, the private terminal had become a very different place. The morning sun streamed through the windows as Dr. Sarah Johnson walked through the entrance, this time for a very special occasion. The airport was hosting a national conference on inclusive security practices, and she was the keynote speaker. In the main hall, aviation security experts from across the country had gathered. The same terminal where Sarah had once faced discrimination was now a model for others to follow. Diana Chen stood at the podium, introducing the day's events. "6 months ago, we faced a crisis," Diana began. "Today, we're leading the industry in progressive security practices, and we owe much of this transformation to Dr. Sarah Johnson." The audience applauded as Sarah took the stage. Among them were security chiefs from major airports, airline executives, and even government officials. On the screens behind her, statistics showed the impact of their new programs. Passenger complaints down by 85%. Security staff diversity increased by 60%. 0 reported incidents of discrimination. Employee satisfaction at an all-time high. "Change is possible," Sarah began, looking out at the eager faces. "What happened to me was unfortunate, but what came after was extraordinary." In the front row, James Washington, the new head of security, nodded proudly. His team had become known for their professionalism and respect. The security staff now reflected the diversity of their passengers, speaking multiple languages and understanding various cultures. A news crew filmed the event for a national documentary about transforming corporate culture. Their cameras panned across the terminal, showing the visible changes. Diverse security teams, clear and respectful signage in multiple languages, and a welcoming atmosphere. During the lunch break, Sarah met with a group of security officers who had completed the new training program. One of them, a young woman named Maria Garcia, shared her experience. "Dr. Johnson, your story changed how we approach our jobs," Maria said. "Now we focus on actions and documentation, not appearances and assumptions." The afternoon session included a panel discussion where Sarah sat alongside other industry leaders. They discussed how the airport's new protocols were being adopted nationwide. The governor's office had already implemented similar programs at all state transportation facilities. What happened to Richard Miller? Someone in the audience asked. Diana stepped forward to answer. Mr. Miller's story is also educational. He now participates in our training videos, sharing how his biases led to his downfall. He's learned from his mistakes and helps others avoid similar errors. The conference's final presentation revealed the airport's latest initiative, a scholarship program for minority students interested in aviation security careers. Sarah had helped design the program, ensuring it would create lasting change in the industry. As the day went down, Sarah walked through the terminal one last time. The same security checkpoint where she had faced discrimination now had a plaque reading, "Dignity, respect, security, the new standard." A flight crew passing by greeted her warmly. Everyone knew Dr. Johnson now, not because of the incident, but because of the positive changes she had helped create. The terminal's atmosphere was noticeably different. Professional but warm, secure but welcoming. Diana joined Sarah for a final walk through the terminal. "You know," Diana said, "when this happened 6 months ago, we thought it was our worst day. It turned out to be the beginning of our best chapter." Sarah smiled, watching a diverse group of passengers being processed efficiently and respectfully through security. "Sometimes it takes a crisis to create meaningful change," she replied. As they reached the exit, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message. The governor wanted to expand the program to other states. What had started as one uncomfortable incident had sparked a national movement in aviation security. Dr. Johnson called out a young security officer as Sarah prepared to leave. "Thank you for not just getting angry, but for helping us get better." Sarah paused at the door, looking back at the transformed space. The terminal had become more than just a passage for private flights. It was now a symbol of how crisis could lead to positive change, how prejudice could be transformed into progress, and how one person's dignity could help restore dignity for all. "Remember," Sarah said to Diana as they said goodbye, "true security comes from respect, not fear." That's the lesson we all learned. As she walked to her car, Sarah saw a new group of security trainees arriving for their shift, representing every race and background. The sign above the door caught the afternoon sun. "Welcome to the future of aviation security, where everyone rises together."